In this tutorial, I'm going to look at the transition from Maya to After Effects and the things you will consider when you're planning to render. Probably when you're watching this, you're not even close to the rendering stage for your MRP, but it's something that you should be thinking about even early on so you can plan things out appropriately. So I've set up a simple scene and animated and rendered out a short animation, and it's here. Let me just play it. Just a couple of neurons, some synaptic cleft, and you see some vacuoles or whatever those things are coming down the axon into the bouton of the nerve. Now, it's not a great little animation, but it does a lot of things, and it's actually really quick to set up in Maya, and it requires some thinking when it comes to render layers. Now, a few things I want to touch on here are how we break things up into render layers, how we can use our render layers instead of using transparency in our shaders. So, for example, these particles inside the neuron show up because of the way I've laid them out in render layers to appear like they're inside the neuron, rather than trying to make a transparent shader in Maya. Also, you can see there's sort of a foggy effect here, some slight background complexity. There's depth of field, so these things are getting blurry as you go farther away from the camera. So those are the things that I'm going to talk about, and these are all the things we do in After Effects by compositing different layer types together. Okay, so let's just look in Maya. Now, I'm not going to explain how I built everything because it's all pretty basic. But what I do want to look at is how I arrange the render layers. But just so you know, it's just two objects here. Just one thing model duplicated, flipped around. So we've got a synaptic cleft here. There are some particles here using curve flow. You've probably used curve flow before when you do blood flow, so it's the same thing. It's under the under the effects menu here. Create curve flow. So I'm just using that curve that I put down the middle of that neuron and making these particles flow along it. In terms of lighting the scene, if I just get out of my camera here, I've just got my shot cam, so different than my perspective camera. I've got a fill light here and a key light here. So I'm lighting from the upper right, filling in from the lower left, and I thought I had one more light in here. Yep. Another light here, and this is just oh, sorry, that's the key. This spotlight, so the key is up here, lighting from the upper right, fill from the lower left in this case. Then I have this other spotlight that I forgot to name, but it's sort of my kicker light. It's giving me a highlight on the edge of my object from the camera view, and it kind of helps to set it off in the background. Although if we look at the QuickTime, I really dialed down the specular in the end. But I rendered it out separately, so I was free to do that. So just a little 3-point light setup, and just simple objects. Now, the other thing you'll notice, if I go back to my camera, I've composited using my resolution gate here turned on, and I make sure I have the resolution set properly, so everything works as it should. Now, in terms of shaders on here, I just have one simple shader really for the primary shader, this kind of bumpy blend. Then I've got another shader, and I didn't name them. Bad. Neuron color. This is my specular shader. Oops. And I also have this is my particle mask shader and my ambient occlusion shader. So it's a really simple scene, but if you look here in my render layers, you'll see that I have a lot of render layers going on here to do everything that I want. So let's look at what each one of them is. And the reason that I'm using so many render layers is that it gives me the freedom in After Effects to adjust everything separately. And I'll rebuild this all in After Effects for you. But we have the master layer here, so that has everything on it. The Neuron RGB, so that RGB just means it's my main color color layer. So this is the main neuron here. I've got the close neuron here, and I'm just rendering them out separately so I can, because my camera's not moving in this shot, I can easily just put this on top of this neuron in After Effects. And it just allows me, if I want to control the color of each one separately, if I felt like I had to change that. The ambient occlusion shader, I don't think this one's set up properly. If I want to, just to remind you, if I want to turn this into an ambient occlusion shader, I can use one of the preset settings. If I just right click on it, go down to attributes, in the attribute editor here under presets, I can go to occlusion, and I'll turn that into my occlusion layer. I've got a depth layer, which also has a preset under attributes, preset luminance depth. I've got a layer with just my particles on it. You can see I also have the lights in it because I was rendering it with software. I've got a particle mask, which is this object on it. Now, what the particle mask is doing for me is it's masking its shader on this neuron that I'm using a fall off shader. If I just do a quick render, you can see what I mean. So instead of making a transparent shader in the color channel, like in the Neuron RGB here, I just have a solid looking shader. And let me just save this one and re-render this one. So I just have a solid looking shader, and it has no specular on it. There's no transparency. Instead, I'm using this mask that I rendered out just with a fall off shader, you know, the ramp and the sampler info node type shader that I can use to mask out the particles. So they'll be more visible in the black areas, and then when they go into these areas here, they'll be less visible, and they'll be more visible here. And this allows me to do it all in After Effects using a Luma matte rather than trying to mess around with transparency in Maya. And there's nothing wrong with transparency in Maya, but it just gives you no flexibility after the render is done to change it. So we're going to use that layer mask to mask out the particles to simulate transparency of the neuron. And then I've got a specular pass here. If I just do a render of this, you'll see all it is a black blin with the same bump. It's a Brownian bump piped into the bump channel of this blin. It's black, and then I just have the specular turned to pure white. So I can render this out separately, and then I can composite it on top of my shader, and it can also go on top of the particle layer, so it looks like the particles are going underneath the specular. Although I didn't set it up perfectly, it would have been better if the specular went a little more over where the particles were. But anyway, doing it this way does give me a certain amount of freedom. Now, if you look at the QuickTime here, it's a little hard to tell, but there's some slight camera movement, so you can see this thing going up and down. And that's something I also did in After Effects. Rather than trying to make a little shaky camera in Maya, I did it in After Effects. And that gives me the freedom to tweak it and play with it. But it also means that, because I didn't do it in Maya, that I only have to render out one frame for most of these render layers. The only one I have to render out more than one frame is the particle layer, because there's some animation on it. Everything else, there's no animation because my camera doesn't move at all. So having a static camera makes your rendering a lot easier. not always appropriate, but when if it is appropriate, it makes your life a lot easier. So, and just to remind you, if I want to put something on a render layer, I simply go to the master layer, I select the object and say I wanted to create a new render layer for this neuron, and just click this button here, the little new layer button with the blue sphere on it, and it creates a new layer with that object on it. And once you're in a render layer, you can either go to the attributes here by right-clicking on the render layer, and you can choose one of these presets: specular, shadow, diffuse, geometry matte, all these different things. Or you can simply create a new material that you want to use in this layer and just drag it on. So say, for example, this was my specular. I make this specular material, which again is just a blend that's black, has the bump map put on it that the other the main color material has, and then I have specular color turned all the way up, and I have the eccentricity and specular roll off set such that it controls the size and intensity of the specular. And then I can just drag and drop this onto this object, and it changes the material, but only in this layer. So if I go down to another layer that has that object on it, it preserves its original material here. Another thing you can do in these render layers is, say for example, I want to, in this layer, let's say I want this spotlight to act a little differently. Let's say in this, right now I've got emit diffuse turned off, so on all layers it's going to not emit diffuse, it'll only emit specular light. If I right click on any attribute on any object in any render layer, I can say create layer override. See, it turns orange. I can turn on emit diffuse, but because I made a layer override before I turned it on, if I go to any other layer, it's still back to its default state. So that's what you use render layers for. Typically are using the presets, using new materials that you just drag and drop on for that layer, or you can create layer overrides for anything, for any object within the layer, and you can also do it for the render settings. So here's my sample layer I just created. Down the side here, these little boxes indicate which layers are renderable. So if I do a batch render, it's going to render all of these layers that are depressed. If I turn that one off, go next to it, it's not going to render that during the batch render. It'll render everything else. This one here is to change the render settings for this particular layer. If I just go to the general render settings, you can see I've got certain things set up, like the start frame is 1, the end frame is 1. So everything is rendering only one frame. But say, for example, in this layer, I wanted to render 10 frames. I can click on the render layer button for this layer. Sorry, the render settings button for this layer, and you can see up here it says render layer, layer 2. It's using mental array. Let's say I wanted to use the Maya software render here. I could do create layer override, choose Maya software. I could go down to the end frame, create a layer override, and change for this layer I wanted to render out 10 frames. If I go to any other layer, you'll see that it defaults to the default number of frames I wanted to render. If I go to the particles layer, you can see I changed this one earlier. I created an override because I want 300 frames rendered from here. Okay, now the other interesting thing to do here, if we just look in my file structure, if I just go find where I set up the project here, if I go into my, and this is my mock MRP folder, like you should be working in the render folder, I've got sequence 1, shot 2, shot 3. I'm working on shot 3 right now. And you can see there's a folder named according to what I named the render layer. See, there's depth, there's neuron AO, neuron close RGB, neuron RGB, and so on. How did I make that happen? Well, that's something you do in the render settings in Maya. So if you just go to the master layer and open up the render settings, you can see here under file output, it says file name prefix, and it has this render layer / render layer. This is a default. If I just delete that and right click on it, you can see there are a whole bunch of default naming strategies, and I always use this insert layer name. So that will name each file that's rendered out according to the layer name. But I also want to put them in their own folders. So if I just put a / and choose the same thing again, render layer, it's going to create a folder according to the render layer name, and then name each file within it according to the render layer name. So that's the way I like to set it up, and it makes life a lot easier. You'll also notice that for my default, oh, no, it doesn't matter here. Okay, so let's just go into After Effects and start building up this file, or sorry, this project. So I've done it here already, and you can see that it's not that complicated. There are a few nested compositions in here. I'll try and do it exactly the same as I did before. So let me just close these. I don't want to see these. And I will just start building it up again. So the only thing with any animation on it is the particle layer. So I'm going to drag that onto my composition button here. Just because the reason that it's useful to do that is because it just reads the number of frames and makes the composition that long. If you wanted to change the length of the composition, you just go to composition settings, but now it's all set up properly for me. And I'm going to start building up the project. So I want to bring in my neuron. So that's the main one there. So you can see that it rendered out and there's no specular on here. It's just the color. You can see the fill light in here, the main light here. And then I've got my neuron close, so I'm going to bring that in. It should sit on top here in the stack of layers, so it looks like it's on top. I also rendered out an ambient occlusion pass, so I can drag that on here. I'm just going to set that to multiply. Now you can see that the ambient occlusion is multiplying the background, and we're getting pure white. So what I want to do here is just create a background plate. So just hit Command Y for a new solid, and I'll just make it black. And just put it at the bottom of the stack. So it just gets rid of that. So the ambient occlusion here, you can see it's darkening up the area in the synaptic cleft. And it makes them appear like they're a little more related to each other. Now it's probably a little too dark, but you know, I can just grab this and dial down the transparency if I want to lighten it up a little bit. Okay, so what else do I have here? I've got my particles, which I already brought in. So the particles should go in front of on top of the neurons. Just move over here a little bit. So there they are. But it should go underneath the close neuron. So see that one there was escaping. Here, so I want to block that one out by putting this close neuron, this bouton in front over top. So now my particles are just sitting on top of my neuron, and that's so it doesn't look exactly perfect. So one thing I could do to make it look transparent, I can just dial down the, whoops, that's the wrong thing. Just grab the particles, hit T, and just dial down the transparency to make them look like they're inside. Now that works pretty well, but you can see that where the particles are close to the edge of the object here, they're still as visible as they are when they're in the middle of the object. And I want the transparency to be more of a Fresnel transparency, and that's why I rendered out the particle mask. So I can grab that and bring it in. And now it's just got to sit right on top of the particle layer. And then I can use it as a track matte. So here under particles, if you just move over, If you don't see it, you have to press this button down at the bottom. Toggles, switches, and modes. I can say I'm not using alpha, I'm using the luma values, so the black to white values in the color channels. And I want to use, what do I want to use? Let's look at it. So I wanted to mask them out in the white areas, and I want them to be visible in the black areas. So I want to use a luma inverted matte, I think. Yep. So here where it was a white area, it's going to block the particles. And in the other areas, they're more visible. So my particle opacity is already down to 28%, but when I turn it up, you can see that they're more visible here than they are here, and they're more visible in the middle than they are towards the edge. So of course, because this is a separate layer, I can go in and make adjustments to it if I don't want it so black or so white. And I can use something like, go to Effects, Color Correction, and I can use something like Curves or Levels, and just start adjusting the black and white points. So maybe I want to pull in the black. Oops, wrong way. So it's not pure black, so it's going to be blocking them out a little bit everywhere. So even though they're at 100% everywhere, they're still not so apparent even in the darkest areas. Okay. The other thing too, I can, because I rendered everything out separately, I can go into the particles and think, oh, well, they have no color. I just rendered them out gray. Really, I probably would have been better off rendering them out white or something, but I can still go in and go to Effect, Color Correction. Here I can use hue and saturation, and I can colorize them if I want to. So now you can see they've got a slight red tint, and just turn up saturation so it makes it look a little clearer. And then dial down the hue and find something that kind of complements the yellow a little bit, or at least stands out against it. Let's do red ones this time. And I can turn up the lightness, and that will affect, oh, it's kind of, that's a horrible color. Let's do blue. By turning up the lightness, it kind of flattens them out a little bit, and it makes them a little more apparent. Now I think their opacity is just too high generally, so I can just turn it down. And I can also, say, put a little blur on them if I want to. Now they're going to be blurred later on when everything is blurred, but for now I'll just put Gaussian blur just to soften them up a little bit. And this is, because we're doing this all in After Effects, we're free to experiment. Okay, so let's just leave things as they are, and we can tweak them later on. The ambient occlusion channel is just black and white. If I just go to normal, so it just looks like this. But I can also colorize this if I want to add a little color in that area rather than just have it pure black. So I can just, again, go to color correction and use hue and saturation. And colorize it, give it a slight red feeling. I don't know. Multiply. So you're getting kind of that red bleed in there, and I can still dial it down a little bit. And so when you're doing this in After Effects, it's obviously a lot more responsive than when you do it in Maya, because you don't have to keep re-rendering every time you try something new. So what's left to do? Well, we've got the depth pass that we rendered out. So the depth pass looks like this. If I just drag this on top, I want to make sure that if I right click on interpret footage for depth, I just want it to be on ignore. So if there's an alpha channel, it just ignores it. Same thing with ambient occlusion. You want to make sure the ambient occlusion file that you import into After Effects, go to interpret footage main, is also on ignore. Everything else is generally on pre-multiply against black. Yeah, so because when you render out of Maya, it's probably multiplying against black, and that means it can just extract that black color in the edge pixels of any object, and that means everything can composite together because it takes the black out of the slightly transparent anti-aliased edge pixels, and it lets everything show through. If you don't do that, you'll get a little black halo around everything. All right, so now how do we use our depth channel? We've talked about this before, but there are a couple of ways of doing it. The simplest thing to do is just to go and create a new layer, an adjustment layer, put it under the depth channel, and put a blur on the adjustment layer. Effect, blur, and I can just use a fast blur here because it allows me to repeat the edge pixels. Let me just turn this off for a second. So I can just turn up the blur, and you can see that if I don't repeat the edge pixels, it starts to go black towards the edge. If I turn that on, it just corrects that in sort of an artificial but seamless kind of way. So right now the blur is being applied to everything beneath the adjustment layer. But if I tell it to use the depth layer as a track matte, a Luma inverted track matte, then it's going to put the blur preferentially on the darker areas. But our depth map is not that great right now because it goes from a light gray to a slightly darker gray. So I'm going to adjust the levels, or maybe I'll just use curves again, just because it gives me a graphic representation and slightly more control over how the levels work. So one thing I want to do is just pull that black point in so it kind of eats up this neuron, or the axon here. And so we're going to get a nice pure blur going from here to here. And then I want to pull the white point in so I get really no blur in these areas here. The only place that you'll find a problem is these areas where it goes from, rapidly jumps from one color gray to another color of gray, and you'll start to see a sharp edge in there. There are some workarounds for this, but for now, we'll just look at this simple setup. So if I just turn off the visibility here, you can see that now the blur is being applied here, and it falls off until you get to a less blurry area here, which is what we want. And because it's affecting everything underneath it, it's also affecting the particles and all that sort of stuff. All right. So now if we just go back to my QuickTime here, open recent, you'll see that I don't have a black background here. And if you watch it carefully, you can kind of see that it's sort of changing slightly and moving slightly. It's actually a little more jittery than I thought it was going to be, but I'll show you what I did to get that, and there's probably better things we can do. I'm going to create another solid for the background. Whoops. Create another solid. And I'm going to put it down here. I'm going to start naming these things so I don't get lost. So this is my BG black plate. And then I'm going to call this BG texture. And I'm going to use the cellular texture that is here in After Effects. So I can go to Effects, and where is it? It's under Simulation. No, it's under Generate, Cell Pattern. I'm going to turn off my blur for a minute. So it just creates this cellular pattern, and I can change its size. So it's kind of big. I can invert it somewhere. And you can animate this as well. So just by changing the evolution, so you can just have some interesting animation in the background. But to make it kind of even better, I can just duplicate this. So Command D of this layer. And so it's exactly the same, but maybe I'll make this size a little bit bigger. And I have to see everything underneath it, so I can maybe add. So now you see they look a little too much alike, but if I change the evolution, they kind of sit over top of each other and make a kind of interesting pattern. Now, all these things can be animated. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to on frame 1, just set a key on evolution for this one layer, go to the end, and just change it slightly, and it automatically sets another keyframe for me. If I hit U, it shows me there's anything that's keyed in this layer. Then I can do the same thing for this one. I can just set a key here. Maybe I'll have this one go in reverse order, so something like that. And it automatically sets a key for me, or it should. If I hit U, we can see, yep. So now if we just play the animation, it's moving, I think, but super slowly. Yeah, you can see it is moving. So it's just a vague background. And I'm going to pre-compose these two things together so I can control their transparency together. So I can select these two layers and hit Command-Shift-C to pre-compose. And that just turns them into their own composition. And so it acts like a single layer. So I'll call this animated BG, background. And this way, now that it's all in one layer, I can just affect its transparency altogether. And if I turn the blur back on, so we get this kind of background. A little different than the way I did it before, but there's still a couple things I'm going to do. Now if we look back in QuickTime again, oops, going to open it again. You can see that not only is there sort of a focal shift, so there's a depth of field, so things blurred out in the background, but there's also, it seems to be a fog. Now you can do this in Maya, you can render out an environment fog, but once you do that, you can't really change anything. But we can rely on our depth pass to do this for us too. So let's say I just duplicate this depth pass, or depth layer, and I'm going to create a new solid, and this one I'll make kind of a 50% gray or something, and I'll call this fog solid. Excuse me. And if I put it under the depth in this new depth pass, I can use that as a Luma inverted matte, and we get this kind of simple, easy fog effect. And if I just look at the effect controls here, I can still control the curves to pull in the black point, and we'll pull the fog forward, pull it back, and of course I can just turn down the transparency on this solid layer. So you can see we're kind of getting closer to what I had here. And you can also do things like put noise on this fog solid. So if I just go to Effect, Noise, turn up the noise. It's a lot. Turn off color noise. Turn it down. And then maybe I want to put all this stuff underneath the adjustment layer. Do I want to do that? I'm not sure, because that's going to blur the actual depth channel. That looks good, actually. So I can go in here and turn up the noise a little bit. If it goes too much, it's going to bleed into that area. So it just kind of breaks up the image and doesn't make it look quite so perfect. Now I could render out some floaty particles in Maya too if I wanted to. That's the beauty of doing these things in render layers. If there's something I feel that I need to add, I can just go back in and render out another pass and integrate it here into After Effects. Okay, so this is too long for me to play, but if I just want to preview a little bit of it, say just put the time slider here, hit B, that puts the beginning of the work area. Move it over, hit N for the end of the work area. I can do a bit of a RAM preview within this area just to see what the effects look like. You can see that the noise is actually animated, and I didn't really notice it in the last one, but it's kind of It's a little bit super animated, so I can't turn that down. You can always try a different type of noise. Should save my file before something terrible happens. Noise. You can try something like turbulent noise. Now, actually, I find this doesn't work that well. It tends to look a little bit flat, this turbulent noise. But can try it. So there's my turbulent noise. Just turn down the contrast a lot. And you can, just like the cell pattern, you can change its evolution. So I could animate this using this. But anyway, I'll just leave it like that for now. You can see my particles are coming through. They're not appearing that strongly, so I could, even go in and choose to say maybe effect, stylize, put a glow on them if I wanted to. Turn up the intensity. Can never remember what direction I should be going in for this. But anyway, so you can see I've built it largely to be the same as before. The background plate I find is a little underexpressed here. I'm going to turn it all the way up. Maybe not quite all the way. There's a bit of a sharp drop off here, so I could go into my depth and for the fog layer, pull it back a little bit. It's going to be really hard to get rid of that totally because there is just a drop off in the geometry there. In this layer here too, I can. But anyway, that's just something you have to tweak and play with to get it the way you want. So that's a little bit better. So this is coming into focus and out of the fog a little earlier. And if we don't want it to be this kind of gray, I can change this fog solid. If you want to adjust a fog's color, you can go to Command-Shift-Y. Sorry, not a fog, a solids color. I can just, tug it into the gray area, or to this kind of reddish area. And nothing happens because I've got this turbulent noise on it. But if I turn that off, you can see it goes into this, you can see the redness. But if I want the turbulent noise, and I also want the kind of red color, I can just go in and effect. This is on the fog solid, and color correct it. Again, I always just sort of default to the hue saturation. And because this is occurring in this stack of effects, it's occurring after the turbulent noise, it's going to affect the turbulent noise too. So I can just colorize it like that. It's a little too saturated. Just dial down the saturation a little bit. And just to add a little bit of color like that. Now the one thing I haven't added yet is my specular. I rendered the specular out separately. If we just look at that, it just looks like this. It's just all pure specular. So I can drag this into my scene. Again, it's only one frame long, but it's stretched out to match the entire thing. And that's going to have to go underneath the ambient occlusion, but we want it on top of the neurons and on top of the particles. Ooh, that looks pretty cool, actually. And you want to change the blend mode to add. You want to change the blend mode to add of the correct layer. And so you can see it just all the black disappears and we're just left with the white. Oops. And again, I can just dial down the opacity if I think it's too much. If I just want a slight touch of it, it looks a little plasticky to me, and that's why in the final render I really dialed it down. But you can always, if it's not right, you can go back in and render it out again with different settings in Maya without having to re-render every single thing. Now the last thing I want to do is to make that kind of shaky camera sort of thing. So you can see it looks like everything's moving a tiny bit. Now you can do that in Maya, but if you don't like it, then you've got to go back and do the whole thing over again. So let's do it in After Effects. So I've created this whole um, composition. It's called particles 1 because I dragged the particles into the composition button to create it. I'm going to rename it toot for tutorial comp. And I'm going to drag this whole comp into a new comp. So it's a nested composition. And I'm going to set some keys on its position. Well, actually, first thing I'm going to do is scale it up. So it's a little bit bigger than the composition. So you may want to plan ahead for this so things wouldn't get cut off when you scale it up, because I'm going to shake the whole plate around. So I'm making it a little bit bigger, but I'm also just going to set a couple keyframes, one at the beginning on position and one on the last frame. Just click here to add a new keyframe. I didn't change anything, and I think it should still work. And just click on the layer, or sorry, click on the attribute that's been animated. And I've got the wiggler window turned on here. That's right, the wiggler. So if you go to window, if you don't see it, you can go to window, turn on wiggler. And what this does is just break up the keyframes here and just randomize them slightly. So right now the frequency is 5 per second, which is way too much. I can just say 1 per second, and maybe the magnitude is 3. That's how much it's going to move around. Just say apply. You can see it inserts keyframes in here. So you can see what it's done here. It's just add some animation. So if we preview it, if it'll allow me. So you can see there's some movement now. Really nice and subtle. And it took no time to do. And if I don't like it, I can just get out of this graph mode. I can just grab all these keyframes, delete them, and say, you know, that magnitude 3 wasn't enough. I'm going to go to magnitude 4 and apply it again. And preview it. And play it back, and it just moves a little bit more. Now, the one thing you may want to consider, you have to think ahead when you do this, because you'll want to render in a little further out in Maya, so you have more frame that you can sort of discard in this way. And you may want to look at your title and action safe here. So this is your title safe box, is this one here. You shouldn't really have any labels or titles outside of there. And the action safe, you don't really want any action happening outside of this area. And really you want everything to be a little more central, not necessarily in the middle, but sort of more centrally located. You can still compose within these areas, but be aware that, and this was originally put into place for the hardware that this stuff was shown on for TV screens, where some of the casings would cover over this area, and sometimes the edges of the screen couldn't render stuff as well as the middle of the screen, things like that. So be aware that you should be working within the title and action safe, even though with modern screens and when you show it on a computer or project it, it's really not as important. However, you never really want any action happening down here, and you never want titles really so tight to the edge. So just try and respect these things, and you can turn those on and off here. And so really, that's it. You can see it didn't take, it didn't take long to do. The Maya scene itself is incredibly simple. The only thing that takes some time is just getting used to working with render layers. But the thing with render layers is that just build it up little by little. You know, you need an RGB pass, a color pass. You can break up the foreground from background objects. You can add ambient occlusion. We almost always do ambient occlusion now. You can extract the specular. And to make sure I didn't have any specular on here, in this case, I just went to the material on here and just turned specular down to 0. I also turned reflectivity down to 0 because I'm rendering with mental ray, so I didn't want any reflectivity. But if there's a special case where you sort of want specular from one light, not from another, for example, or you can select the light itself and you can turn off emit specular in the light. And so that can be a layer override too. Okay, so yeah, and you can, I didn't do any shadows in the scenes, but it wasn't really necessary. But you can see I relied on things like my ambient occlusion and my depth pass, my particle mask to do things like fog, like transparency that you can do in Maya without any problem, but it just doesn't give you much flexibility. So I hope this is useful to you, and also shows you the benefit of rendering with a relatively still camera or an absolutely still camera in Maya, because that way you only have to render one frame for many things if there's actually no animation on them, and only render out multiple frames for things that are animated. This is not to say you should never use a moving camera, but think about it, whether you need it or not. Think about whether it adds to the clarity of what you're trying to show, or if it's merely a distraction. So please take these things to heart and use them in your own MRP, and I'm sure they'll help you get things done faster and more efficiently. Thank you.